Okay, so welcome everybody to Commodities People's webinar. Is the current context in energy trading changing your ETRM strategy? And we have a really good panel to talk about that this afternoon. But before we get started, I'd just like to remind you that if you want to ask questions to the panel, please do use the facilities here on Zoom to do so. I will try my best to pick up on those questions and direct them accordingly. Just let's do some introductions to get started. My name is Gary Vasey. I'm the managing partner here in Europe with Comtech Advisory, and we also run CTRM Center. And I'd like to ask the three gentlemen with me to do a short intro, starting with Alex. We'll go alphabetical.
Afternoon, everyone. Alex Whitaker, I'm General Manager at Bonroy Betchem, the startup small trading house. I run all of our post-trade, all of our technology, CTRM, and then before joining Bonroy, I was working in CTRM consulting for previous 10 years.
Samir?
Hi, I'm Samir Saleja, a founder of Molecule, one of the largest cloud-native ETRM vendors in the world. We're excited to be here.
Soren?
Hi, I'm Soren Eriksson. I'm head of partnering and governance within Mabanav, previously head of commercial capability, basically in touch with our ETRM strategy and the directions for the last 10 years.
Great. So to get started, obviously things are changing and shifting very rapidly, almost on a daily basis. I think I've referred to the perfect storm. Just about everything that can be happening seems to be happening in the commodities world. And of course, that must have a significant impact on CTRM, ETRM software and strategies. I'd like to start out by asking perhaps Alex, what are the key things happening to your business right now that are impacting your ETRM software functionality?
So obviously we're in a period of very high volatility in changing markets, particularly in gas. So there's a lot more focus on risk. Even today, there's been a lot of questions I've been involved in with budgets for VAR and margin and things like that. The board are putting a lot of pressure on those to understand those figures. And I think that sums it up quite neatly in terms of risk capital. Being able to understand your exposures quickly and accurately. So for me, there's a lot of pressure on the CTRM to be working in the way it's designed, the way it should. It's not acceptable anymore that we would just go a whole day without a position or a P&L report, for example. We need all of those things quickly and accurately. Some of the newer things are a bit more pressure on understanding margins. Obviously, that's something that the CTRMs, it's not, they don't do that at the moment. There are one or two vendors out there who are looking into margin risk and say margin as a service. And that's something as well. Again, there's pressure on risk capital.
Yeah, there's definitely some new requirements emerging. Soren, what are you seeing? Anything on the ESG side as well, specifically perhaps?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, Mabanav's historic footprint, right, is very much in the middle distillates, oil product space, right, and with the whole world aiming for decarbonization, emissions reductions, the whole concept of biofuels, of emissions trading becomes significantly more important, right? And where 10 years ago you were able to make a good margin by having a better offset or better import price than others, today it's not just the landing price in ARA that is determining your margin. It's very much how you are able to manage your emissions, how you're able to do your blending, how you supply your biotopics. So especially in markets which aren't quite as volatile and quite as liquid as other markets are.
Samir, as a vendor, what sort of pressure are you getting from your users around meeting functional requirements that are emerging under these current market conditions?
Yeah, it's a great question, Gary. I think, starting out, we figured near real-time position P&L would be an important thing for folks, as Alex mentioned, but that's just sort of table stakes for us. And for anybody we talk to, it seems sort of table stakes. What we see people asking for are certainly enterprises wanting access to raw data that they can combine with data from other systems in, for example, a data lake. And also sort of to what Soren mentioned, everything and anything renewables related, managing offsets, managing regulatory requirements around those offsets and or credits, and keeping that madness straight is something that people are really looking to see their CTRMs handle.
Yeah, I think you raise a very, very interesting point here, and sorry for jumping in. Right, it's not just the markets that are changing. And Alex was also pointing in that direction. Technology is accelerating over the last 5, 6, 7, 8 years. It's tremendously. So I'm always telling people who have a different view on IT how excited it is to be in IT, because things that were theory 10 years ago are now everyday reality. Right, and that clearly has an impact on ETRM strategies, and what you do and how you do it.
Yeah, which is interesting, because I see a lot of potential for automation. So I'll go straight back to Samir. Are you seeing a lot of interest in automating things? And if so, what are the steps that people need to consider in order to truly automate some activities?
Yeah, I think that's a great question, Gary. Automation, at least from what we hear in the market, is another thing that seems to be table stakes for a modern piece of software. So we've built something like 30 integrations to other systems that are sort of out of the box. And every day we're being asked for more. And it's a totally reasonable thing in 2022 to say, look, I've bought this large piece of software. It should integrate to other systems and therefore automate the ingestion of data and export of data to all of those systems. So yeah, I mean, from what we hear is integration to everything is important, and the steps taken to do it sort of vary by vendor of the system that you have. For some companies, it's okay, well, please flip the switch for us. But for others, it's, well, let me stand up a whole project around it and make sure to validate the integration and test it and get it out the door. So it just really, I think the steps depend on the vendor that you have.
Alex, Soren, what about you guys? Are you seeing any, and what does automation have value for you? And if so, where, and what are the prerequisites?
Yeah, there's definitely value in automation. It's a key part of having an open mind about technology and what is possible. But it's also very difficult, and you have to accept the fact that a lot of the problems that you have are to do with sets of choices that have been made over a long period of time, are to do with difficult people in their roles seeing it their own individual way. So, I mean, the main prerequisite is to make sure that your administrative processes are automatable, basically. I mean, it's all very well going, oh yeah, automation, brilliant, technology, brilliant. But often what would happen is if you found yourself getting sold down that road and you sort of like leap into that, you'll find that your processes aren't good enough to automate. So you won't get any benefits. So this is where you have to be quite, it can take a lot of time, and it involves a lot of sort of investment in people and your internal processes. And then when they're good enough, then of course you can automate them. And again, a technology project can be something that leads that, gives you the goal that we need to work on our processes to achieve the technology gains we know are available, but we aren't in the right place for that at the moment. I mean, at Bomroy, I've spent a lot of time recently working with our finance team, our settlements team, just to try and get them to understand that, we need to set our processes and have them in line with our CTRM, and then we can start to consider what gains may be available. And then generally, I would find that even though my finance person's like 20 years experience, an ex-CFO, all of these things, all they want to do is set up exactly like the last system they used, and it's a different CTRM. So, I mean, you get intelligent people saying stupid things constantly, and you have to work with them to be able to move that through, to really understand in depth, what we are trying to do and how that works. And I mean, it amazes me how difficult that is and how narrow-minded people are and how set in their ways they are. But if you want technology benefits, that's what you have to do. You have to go right into those details, and you have to work with them, and it takes time. So the best thing you can do is, invest in time and people.
Just to add on to what Alex mentioned, to that last point, when we have worked with customers in the industry on automating something that is sort of non-standard, one of the challenges that we run into is the separation of the what and why versus the how. And sort of as software people, we're really good at figuring out the how, but a lot of times we'll get dictated the how by a customer out in the field, which makes the whole process go a lot more slowly and a lot more deliberately, and ends up with a bespoke solution for somebody as opposed to a generic solution for the industry. And so that's definitely been a challenge for us.
And I can imagine. I think one of the key points here is what do you see your ETRMs project like, right? Is it a IT project, right? Is it a front office project? And I personally always see projects like this as full-blown business transformation projects, right? Because let's face it, that's what it is. We invest a lot of money in ETRM solutions, and ETRM solutions oftentimes come with pre-configured, pre-designed processes, right? And now you have two ways how you can tackle that, right? On the one hand side, you can do it as a transformation. You get a solution that has a built-in flow, which is proven to work, and it's going to deliver the outcomes. And you can check how that actually would work for your business. Or you say, hey, let's start and customize and make the system do it our way. And I think the biggest risk in starting to customize early on, and that also starts with doing requirement engineering on a white sheet of paper, basically, right, is that you start to abuse the good functionalities in the systems, because not even the vendors, and Samir, please correct me if I get it wrong, always know exactly 100% where it breaks if you change stuff. Right. And it's crazy. So if you see these type of activities as transformation projects, and you start by looking at the system, what can the system do? How does the process look? And then kind of do it with an MVP approach. Look at it. This is how the system would work. This is how the flow would work. Then you have a lot of potential, on the business side. But as a result of that, coming back, Gary, to your original question, that is where the automation comes in. Right? Because that is where you have the systems doing what they are designed to do, doing how they are built to do it. And then you can look at, okay, can I make that even more efficient by automating specific steps around that? But it is always about seeing it as a transformation, looking transparently at processes, at people, at data, at technology, also in that sequence. And then you basically go from there when you automate.
Well, and just to add to Soren's point there as well, automating versus adapting to an internal company's custom process. One of the neat things about automation today is that it's not usually that hard if you're doing it between modern systems. But a lot of times what we'll hear is we want automation, but we want to be able to modify the steps in the process as well. So it's automation combined with human intervention, which is, important for some folks, but also can make the process a lot more difficult and a lot more expensive and risky to do.
And isn't that contradicting parts of the automation processes? Because my understanding is always that automation should help you move toward managed by exemption. Right. So you focus on the stuff that's not standard, and the good automated process should drop those out. And instead of manually doing 100 things, you only do 5 because those are the ones that didn't flow through.
Right.
Yeah, there was once a time when I was an executive in a big trading firm, and I had to sign all the confirmation statements, and there were so many of them I could never actually examine them. I just had to sign them. And I'd spend hours signing these things. And if someone could just have automated that for me and just pulled out the exceptions that I needed to look at, that would have made my job not just more optimal, but I would have rested more easily at night, that I'd actually, seen where the trouble might lie ahead. In terms of the landscape out there, it's still fairly, it's a legacy landscape. It's older solutions generally, particularly in places like North America. Just doing our vendor perception study, and it's quite clearly an older type environment in North America, not so much in Europe. What kind of problems do you have with older solutions that have nicely worn in? They've been in place for several years, and hopefully they're working for you, but they don't have all the bells and whistles perhaps, and they're not necessarily readily adaptable, or excuse me, the vendor can't speedily bring things to the table. How do you work with that, Alex?
Well, yeah, it's an interesting problem at the moment. I was having lunch with a vendor CEO yesterday, and was saying that up against legacy systems, like people will be interested in looking at alternative systems. They're generally not very happy with their legacy system, but they're sort of afraid, or they find it very difficult to leave. It is so deeply embedded in the company that's very difficult. And I think, given how bad a lot of implementations have been in the past as well, in that if you go back to a legacy system and you look at what was promised whenever it was done, how much it cost, how long it took, versus what it's delivered, I think most people are probably actually quite frightened about doing that again, because like their experience of, say, an implementation of a CTRM vendor and project is so bad that they don't want to take that on again. Like, the risk becomes very high, certainly the perceived risk, because of what they've experienced before. So in terms of how people get around that, I think some of the better projects I've heard of and seen myself have been hybrid projects, where people really are willing to work alongside a vendor for a considerable amount of time and put that investment, not just of money, but in terms of like developing that system and training their people, investing in their people. And it's really about, say, maybe working for 4 or 5 years with a small team, rather than this idea that you can do a 30-person team and do it in 12 months. I mean, I would say that's completely discredited, that approach. I think it needs to be a longer, slower approach. And like we were talking about with automation, you need to go back to your basics and look at what you are doing as your administrative choices yourselves, and then working with a vendor alongside those for a considerable amount of time. That would be, I think, how you would be able to go away from an unhappy legacy system and develop something better. But I think the amount of time it takes is going to be a lot longer than people were used to in the past. But I think that's the way to be successful.
Soren?
Yeah, I think that there's some very, very interesting items in it. And for me, it comes a bit back to also the question, what do I want my ETRM to do? Right. And if I look at the ETRMs that we operate, right, and looking at Mabanav, we are specific with that regard that we have a super strong physical logistics footprint in the organization, right? So if I look at an ETRM and I say, okay, what is my top priority? It's the ETRM should be able to handle my deal life cycle, right? And that means from trade entry all the way to creating a settlement, and then basically giving me the data on my exposures throughout the process of the deal life cycle. And it's I think a lot of the issues that you see in the organization is not necessarily the age of the system or the scale of the system, but it's the way that the systems were introduced and implemented. Right. So if you have over many years, and I mean that's the heritage of the ETRM systems, right? Is customize, buy a big solution, buy a monolith, and then customize the monolith as much as you can. And I think that clearly creates massive issues. And today that is not how you would do it. So even if you decide on following what I just outlined, if you select a system that quite nicely covers your trade life cycle of the core businesses that you do, you need to stick to the system, you need to stick to the standards, right? You need to stay in line with that, and then look at the whole ecosystem today, because it's not just anymore the core ETRM what you do. You always need to talk about integration layers, you need to talk about data layers, you need to talk about the whole concept. How do I get data in and out of that application? At what point in time, with what frequency, what do I need? And then be very, very clear on what you're going to get where. Because clearly what you will not, or very likely not, get today is this one system that does everything. Because the trend toward today is more, if an ETRM, you do trade entry here, but you do reporting, let's say in Power BI or in Tableau or whatever it is. Oh, and by the way, you do your, and I mean, traders even do that, right? Oh, you use Trayport for capturing certain deals and so on. So it's not a new concept, but it's getting, I would say, more popular in the industry, also related to the technology. So focus on what the stuff does do, what the solutions do well, and then stick with that. And that can also mean, Alex, what you were referring to, co-developing an application together with a vendor that makes it hopefully then fit your needs, but also basically helps move the vendor forward.
And so, Samir, how do you respond to what those two gentlemen just said as a vendor? What lessons have you learned in terms of providing a platform that's agile and adaptable to business change?
Yeah, I mean, I think I agree with pretty much everything Alex and Soren just said. You know, if I think back on our implementations and which ones went well versus the ones that may not that may have taken longer or were more difficult, the more difficult ones were the ones where there was a significant amount of feature set that the customer wanted that wasn't in the core platform, and you know it needed to be done in order to fulfill their particular business processes. And you know the challenge around that is, if as a vendor you come up with what you believe is an abstract standardized solution for this customer who's helping lead you down the path of building some feature set for them, um, it often doesn't agree with what the customer wants, because now the customer's in the driver's seat of defining this abstract business process. And then you wind up building sort of a customized stub, which could end up being an orphan piece of software or something like that, rather than having, you know, a broadly applicable area of functionality in the trunk of the application that evolves over time. So I think, yeah, I think the customizations area, other than, you know, small integrations or reports or things like that, installs where we've had a large number of customizations and a large amount of feature development certainly are the ones that have taken longer.
We have a question here that kind of fits this topic of standardization and automation. So I'll just read it and see if we can get any answers from the panel. What are your opinions around efforts at protocol standardization efforts such as FIX, FPML, CPML, and ISDA CDM? Anybody want to take that one on board?
I can take a crack at it. Certainly, with relationship to FIX, you know, it's nice that that standard is out there, but for anybody who's actually digested FIX before, it's a very, very difficult disaster, and there's, you know, 83 different versions of it. So, you know, from our perspective, Fix solves some guaranteed delivery problems, but doesn't really solve message standardization problems, because everybody sort of has their own version of it. We haven't run into the others, but the places where we've had an easier time integrating with others is where people are using more broadly applicable, say, Silicon Valley type standards like RESTful APIs, JSON interfaces, etc. That said, you know, definitely welcome a set of standards coming up, because it would make everybody's life easier.
Yeah, I don't want to go off on too much of a tangent, but it does seem to me, having been in the industry almost 40 years, that there's standardization attempts never really are that successful. And in order to automate a lot of stuff, we need to standardize stuff. Any thoughts on that from anybody here? How we can better? Is there more impetus to standardize now because of the market conditions, for example?
I think you can see, I mean, just in general, the standardization, say, that VAX and Covantis were doing. That's about processes rather than, say, the technical side. But I think when you look at what's happened there and how they're trying to, say, use things like blockchain and modern technology, it looks to me like the real heart of that is about standardization, and that everybody, you know, just fundamentally doing the same thing, shifting commodities around. You know, we don't all need to have special unique processes to do it. If we all do the same paperwork the same way, then you can do it. And that standardization seems like it's being quite successful. They're making progress on those products. And I think, again, that's actually quite a good sort of proof of concept and a way of showing people, you know, what a good way of doing a technology project is, which is basically a lot of investment and a lot of time.
Yeah.
Anybody else?
Just totally share this view. I mean, we have seen over the last years also with activities like VECT or Congo with a lot of these blockchain initiatives, they are also pushing towards certain standards, right? Pushing certain activities out, making a harmonization effort across the board, and I think that the direction is good. I think the biggest risk that I still see is, and just use an example, right? Use PyDex as a XML data standard, right? And then there's a BP PyDex, and there's the shell PyDex, and there are 15 different versions of PyDex. So why do you still call it PyDex if everyone has their own PyDex, right? I think the industry needs to come together in certain ways to agree standards and then stick to them. And sticking to them is probably what is the biggest challenge, but it is also the thing that takes the most discipline from everyone engaged in the industry and everyone active in the industry to also stop diverting from the standards all the time.
Yeah, that's been my historical perspective, is that like GISB in North America, I remember that one very well. We ended up with a standard plus extensions. So how can that be a standard? And you know, if you want to automate, you need a standard. You can't have standard plus extensions. Yeah, absolutely. I want to ask Alex and Soren then, given all of the things that are happening in the industry, we've talked about some of them, new risks, ESG, that kind of thing. How are your systems bearing up in terms of meeting the new demands upon them?
Our systems that we've got at Bonvoy have been working very well. I mean, all the volatility and this type of thing, I mean, it's not an issue. It's what they're designed for. I mean, like volatility, if you don't like volatility, you shouldn't be trading. So in that respect, as a trading house, this has all been good for us. We've worked very closely with our vendor over the last 18 months, just constantly sort of fixing like small little problems about pricing and averages and things like that. And just working very closely with them and always bringing it back to the same thing, that we accept that if we want something done a certain way and we move away from how the system is designed, then, you know, that falls on us. And, you know, we tried one or two things and then moved back towards it. So we just try to keep thinking through what we're doing, talking with the vendor, listening to the vendor, and trying to stay close to how the system is designed, and then working with them in terms of the system design to get their input on the things that we want to change. Now, overall, that's gone very well. I mean, basically all our reports are done by 7:30 every single morning. There's very few problems. We have all our risk reporting, risk limits, risk monitoring. Everything works to a very high standard. It's very accurate. It goes very well. But you know, that's taken 18 months of just, you know, sort of dogged progress.
Colin, anything, Ted?
Yeah, no. As I think Mabanav situation is slightly different with regards that we are currently using an in-house built solution in 2 of our major locations, and what we have actually done is these solutions clearly are super good in covering our trade life cycle. So we've always been very, very good at knowing our position in the system and being accurate about what is happening in the system, right? And what we've actually done to some degree is make sure that we have access to the data, and then if we had rapid development needs, also cater for that on the outside of the system and in our data and analytics environments, and just to make sure that we're on top of the information that we have. And that also worked fairly well, and for us it showed, as long as you cover, as I was saying earlier, right, as long as you're clear on what your ETRM is supposed to do, in our case, covers the trade life cycle as much as possible, as good as possible. And if you have then access to the data, there's a lot of things you can do on the outside.
And Samir, I guess for you, more of a, to what extent do you try as a vendor to anticipate what's going to drive fundamental changes in your functionality versus listening to the customers that you already have?
Yeah, it's definitely a difficult balance. Usually, what happens is after 5 or 6 different requests from different customers about features that may actually not sound the same, our product and our engineering team sit down and say, well, wait a second, those are all various forms of trade status management. Why don't we make why don't we focus on making the best trade status management feature we can, and then see if it can fit all of these use cases, so we can try to make a standard, at least for our platform, and share it with the customer base. It's easier said than done.
Time's moving pretty quickly, so I want to move on a little bit to, we mentioned it, I think Soren mentioned it, that we're moving towards a sort of new architectural idea for CTRM, and have been for a long time, which is more of an ecosystem of bits and pieces really that work together. To what extent do you think that this really solves the problem? Because if you've been around as long as I have, it seems we go around in circular arguments about, you know, we build it ourselves, we customize, we buy, and we need modular. No, we don't. And to some extent, even though the technology's shifted and it seems different this time, to someone as old as myself, it sounds a bit familiar to something we tried in the past and didn't really work. Anybody?
Well, I think
True.
well, I mean, you have to identify the right problem. But really, the right problem is just making stupid decision after stupid decision. If you make bad decisions, it doesn't matter what ecosystem you have or what technology you have, you've got no chance. So really, what people should be looking at is what went wrong previously. And I think if they look at, you know, it's this thing about you buy an off-the-shelf product and then you don't set your admin processes up to fit it. You know, you try to turn it into a bespoke product. Those bad choices that you then sort of compound and compound turn into project disasters. Now, if you can keep things simple and sort of in some ways, you know, like go for an unambitious project that really fits those very tight core needs, so you get your system up and running, doing the important things like position, P&L, VAR, these types of things, that's what you should be starting with. Now, at that point where you're up and running and you've got, say, your 80% of your core needs going, then you can start to think about what other good decisions can I make to add to this. But I think the problem's been in the past that everybody has this idea that I can do, you know, throw 10 million at it or more and do it in 18, 24 months all at the same time. It doesn't work. It's never worked. And I think if you speak to people in the market and you have sort of off the record conversations where people are willing to be honest, I hear all about these disasters and things, but it comes down to people making good decisions and learning from mistakes in the past. But you can't learn if everyone's just covering it up with a lot of sales and marketing positivity.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Well said. Soren?
Yeah, I totally share Alex you here. It's an iterative step-by-step approach that you need to take, right? And it's the same idea that if you think about an organizational transformation, right? When we have the circles of centralization, decentralization, centralization, decentralization. In each of these steps that a company goes through, you learn, right? And you mature and you get to a new level. And then let's say you centralize to increase your maturity levels, and you decentralize again to get more flexibilities, and you centralize again to increase your maturity level, and so on. And it's a never-ending circle. And it's going to be quite interesting to see what's happening, especially on the architecture side with ETRMs, right? Because the trend at the moment really is modular, avoid customizations and so on. But then again, monolithic architectures and monolithic systems did have a purpose, right? And they do have a certain value. And it doesn't really matter if it's an ETRM or if it's an ERP like SAP, if you have a single system that does everything end to end, and you just at the end get the data out, it's a pretty neat and very convenient way to run. But the complexity of getting there is so significant. So it's going to be interesting to see how that actually evolves. So in the next 10 years, I would say. Yeah, and maybe we've all the question would be the other way around. Have we reached the peak yet for when it comes to modularization of solutions, or is that still a way?
Well, I know at least one vendor who's changed the way that they do implementations, for example. They focus basically on like doing a 3-month implementation to get those core functions going, and only then do they start sort of widening that out and sort of looking at what people might want in terms of Power BI and development and things like that. And I think that's been going very well for them. They changed that about 18 months to 2 years ago. And, you know, and again, it's this thing about, and then I think also the way they run that is they push back on the client a lot and they make the client focused. And they're quite happy to be, you know, a little bit punchy with the client rather than, you know, the client knows everything and we say yes to everything, because that is the path to having tons of billables for a couple of years and delivering almost nothing. But if you focus on this core product and getting the client working at and understanding that and getting the client involved, then your implementations go better. And I know people are doing that.
Yeah, and I know this is overused, right? But at the end of the day, this is agile implementations. That's agile project work, right? You set up an MVP, and that can be an off-the-shelf solution, right? Get it up, get it running, have good defined use cases, put them through the system without touching it too much, and then see what you really need to do, right? And I think that is the way to go for the time being, and everything else. I have to admit, I wouldn't be willing to do it any other way at the moment.
Right. So let's ask Samir, because Samir, you put your money where your mouth is, and you founded a new CTRM entity, obviously with a vision of doing it better. So what have you learned, and how can the industry apply some of the things that you've learned?
Yeah. One thing I've learned, and this sort of addresses one of the questions that just got asked, is, financiers of solutions like of software as a service solutions, for example, like to ask you to build an 80-20 solution. The problem in the ETRM industry or in the trading industry is people don't buy the 80-20 solution. People buy something that looks like a 95% solution. And so getting there for every use case is very, very difficult. I mean, I think that when I talk to people who are outside of our industry about the complexity of the systems and the number of features they have, et cetera, I say basically, look, an ETRM system is kind of like an ERP for energy companies. It's got a similar order of magnitude in terms of features. And so, building them all out takes time. Making sure they work for customers takes time. And basically building an ETRM system is a very, very difficult and long path to walk. It's expensive. The returns are slow. And at some point you hopefully reach critical mass and start to become a standard. But that takes some real time.
Yeah, back a couple of centuries ago, when I was working with a vendor in North America, we used to say it was the sizzle, not the steak, that sold the solution. So that kind of refers to your 80-20 being really 95%, because that 15% is the sizzle, and that's what seems to be what the users tune into during the sales process, rather than some of the things that Alex and Soren have mentioned about keeping it simple and sticking to your knitting and all of that kind of thing. So perhaps we need, as an industry, to think through the procurement process and analyze what we're really doing during that procurement process, and that we're not getting ourselves into trouble by taking a particular path. We're coming up to the last few minutes, so I do want to just take a quick look at some of the questions we've got here. Are the ETRM clients looking forward to SaaS models, managed services, pay-per-use, that kind of thing? So I guess Alex and Soren, what are your thoughts on software as a service versus on-premise traditional license, that kind of thing?
Yeah, I mean, we have a SaaS product that goes very well. It can be frustrating at times in that because I need people to be responding and fixing things within 15 to 20 minutes in the morning. And if they can't do that, I'd rather be doing it myself. So it really comes down to the vendor's service and what they're able to do and working with them on that. Because to be honest, a standard SLA, like service level agreement contract saying 4 hours and 8 hours, that's no good at all. I mean, that means I'm waiting all day. So that's useless. So yeah, if their vendor service is good and you're able to work with them and get things done quickly, brilliant.
Soren, any thoughts?
No, just share, compare,
Okay.
control. Yeah.
So an old buddy of mine, Fran Roland, just asked a question directed at you, Soren. So that comment on just going with the standard features and functionality initially and making changes when you have a better understanding of the capabilities is great. But what role does a proof of concept have these days? Because I think this is an important step when evaluating software. I'd agree with this because that's part of that procurement process.
Yeah.
Why are people not doing more proof of concepts?
It's a very, very interesting question. And we've just gone through a super lengthy selection process, and we've asked ourselves very, very similar questions, right? So how can you tackle these selection processes? On the one hand side, you need to have a proper requirements documentation, right? And you end up having hundreds and hundreds of functional and non-functional requirements, which in long spreadsheets, which you've probably all seen, right? And Samir has probably sleepless nights over getting these spreadsheets, right? And these have a role because you need to tick boxes to make certain things sure. But for me, there's a second step in between. So before you say, well, I think this is my preferred solution, you do want to have, if it's always a proof of concept, not necessarily, but you want to have properly defined business scenarios which you want the vendor to present. And clearly you always know that's going to be in it's going to be their showcase, right? You have showcases, they're going to make it pretty, and if they're good, they're going to make it look like everything works seamlessly and out of the box. That's also not completely true. So I think it's a balance between having proper requirements documentation, long list of requirements, sorry, not getting out of that one, functional and non-functional, having super good scenario definitions, and then having also an implementation approach that works along that road, right? That works along the footsteps of, if you call it MVP, if you call it proof of concept, doesn't really matter. Try to get in early on in the project, get a prototype up and running. Get something up and running that is going to be your development system, and see how the system behaves with the then even better defined business scenarios that you have. And even for the business scenario, 80-20, 90-10, whatever you want to call it, wins you the game, because a lot of your business scenarios are going to be the same. And we as Maverick have 100,000 of truck movements a year, right? And loadings a year. So that alone, if a system is able to cover that flow alone, covers 60-70% of our business activities. So if a system is very, very good at that, first box ticked, and if the MVP is able to handle that quite nicely, also on the implementation, the first big win. So they do have a role. The question is when throughout the process, and focusing on business scenarios clearly defined is, I think, what you need to do.
The best proof of concept I saw was it was 2 weeks, and they had tons of end users in front of the system using it and asking questions. So you've got your business users who've got the business knowledge, putting that to the vendors. Basically, it's the best one I saw. And the fact that people don't do that is just, again, it's symptomatic of the bad decisions that people make. I mean, they're happy to spend, say, 10 million on a system, and they want a 2-day demo from the salesperson showing it to them. I mean, it's insane.
And Sammy, as a vendor, how do you feel about doing proof of concepts, especially if they're unpaid?
Unpaid is very difficult, but then RFP processes are very difficult as well. Exactly. And rarely result in a good solution. I would not want to do unpaid proofs of concept, but one thing that we do is we do extended paid proofs of concept, and sometimes that can take some of the fear out of the conversation for the customer. Did I choose the right one? Did they lie to me about features? Did they paper over some of the things that didn't quite work? I think a good vendor ought to be able to do a paid proof of concept for, a fair wage. And I think it's a great way to de-risk the problem.
Well, the return on investment of paying the vendor to do the proof of concept is enormous. The risk reward is fantastic.
Right.
Yeah, well, we're coming up pretty close to time, so I'm just looking at the questions we've got. I think we've kind of partially answered the first one, actually. And in terms of the second, how does a vendor manage, say, 15 different client solutions in parallel? Really quickly, Samir, how do you do that?
Okay, so for managing those customizations, essentially what we do, which is maybe unusual, is that we have a core application with an API around it. And any customizations happen outside the API. So all we have to do is keep the core application moving forward and guarantee that the API stays the same, or that the interfaces stay the same. And then we can do as many customizations as we want outside of it, as long as they expect the same data and we deliver the same data.
Great. So we're right on time. Time is up. So thank you all, the panel. Thank you for those that listened and sent in questions. Yeah, thanks from me, and that is the end of the show, folks.